Good morning, Europe. You are watching Europe Today.
%12% of the world's population lives in the West, and 88% of the world's population lives outside the West. And let me make one point very clearly and very boldly at the very beginning. How the 12% views China is not how the 88% views China. And so, for example, when you ask about what is China trying to accomplish, and if you want to if I can share with you what I pick up from my conversations with my fellow Asians, with Africans, with Latin Americans, they see that China is trying to come back once again as a strong civilization, which it once used to be. And China, he knows better than I do. He's the China expert. By the way, I'm not a China expert. Let me emphasize that one time. Immediately, I'm a China observer. And of course, we have to be China observers because in Southeast Asia, as you all know, geographically, the power that is going to have the greatest impact on us clearly is China. Just sheer proximity. Just as Latin America will live in the shadow of the United States of America, Southeast Asia has to live in the shadow, actually, of China and India, I must also emphasize. So our perspective and that of other Africans is that we've seen this civilization for 4,000 years go up, go down, go up, go down. And so the return of China is just part of a long 4,000-year history of dynastic cycles. And when the Chinese civilization goes down, it can go down very, very badly. And I think Orville knows better than any of us, went through one of the worst centuries, the century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949. But it's not normal for the Chinese civilization to underperform for so long. It's much more normal for them to come back after a while. So what we see, therefore, from Southeast Asia is the return of a civilization that we have seen for centuries go up and down. So this is a natural return. Now, so when China tries to claim a place in the world as one of the great powers, is a perfectly natural development. Now, you mentioned things, you use words like wolf-warrior diplomacy. And what's interesting is that while the term wolf-warrior diplomacy is so frequently used in the Anglo-Saxon media, and as you know, the Anglo-Saxon media, let's be very blunt about this, has a very jaundiced view of China, and the rest of the world discounts what the Anglo-Saxon media says about China. What the rest of the world does is to look at what China does and then deal with it. And at the end of the day, you will notice that countries have a choice. Do they want to trade with China? Or do they not want to trade with China? And if you look at the deeds, China today does far more trade with the rest of the world than the United States does. By the way, we do want to have trade with the United States too. But trade, as you know, is a voluntary activity. But it benefits the countries that do it. So you take a country like Brazil, which is much, much closer to the United States than it is to China. 20 years ago, it took Brazil 1 year to export $1 billion to China. Today, it takes Brazil 60 hours to export $1 billion to China. So why shouldn't Brazil have a normal trading relationship with China? So you can see, therefore, the point I'm trying to suggest to you is that if you look at many of the countries in the global south, not all, at many of the countries in the global south, they're very happy to have normal relations with China and they have no difficulties. The difficulties have come, as I said, primarily between the United States and China for understandable reasons. This is what would happen when you have a great power shift. And I actually think that in some ways, just as what the United States did towards China was predictable, China's responses towards the United States are also predictable. And I think here I want to emphasize there is only one country in the world that passes judgments on the internal political systems of other countries. It's a very exceptional country. And I think you all know of American exceptionalism. I can tell you that, the UN is not too far away from here. It's a mile or two away. If you walk into the United Nations, you will find that one of the most sacred principles of the UN Charter, which is actually held to very strongly by member states of the UN, is that we will not interfere in each other's internal affairs. That's enshrined in the UN Charter, and that principle is used by most states when they deal with each other. So the attitude of most states in the world is, you choose your form of government. No matter what you choose, we will deal with the government in power. And so whether China is more Marxist or less Marxist, democratic or undemocratic, we cannot get to choose. It's up to the Chinese, at the end of the day, choose what kind of government that they have. But I do think also, if I can or will push a little bit back at you, when the United States first fell in love with China in 1971, can I ask you, who was the leader of China at that point? Was it Mao Zedong? Would you call Mao Zedong a great defender of human rights? Would you say that this is a man with a liberal mind, a liberal spirit, someone you can, develop a kinship with? You know what I'm getting at, right? So when it comes to geopolitics, it's a very cruel business. Ideology can be put aside when necessary, can be brought to the fore when necessary. And even today, if you say that the United States will stand up to Communist parties' regimes, why are you cultivating Vietnam? What's the difference? Doesn't Vietnam also have a communist party in power? So I'm only saying this because the rest of the world, when I say that the rest of the world has changed, they've become much more sophisticated. They see through all this. They see that, yes, there's a serious geopolitical contest going on between the United States and China. They are very worried about it. They want to maintain good ties with both, and they won't pass judgment. And it's not just, to be fair, Orville, it's not just Singapore. I can give you, if you want a list of 100 countries, I can give you a list of 100 countries that are in that position. US-China relations, it's important to emphasize that we are dealing with it within a very, very different global context. And we have to understand different global contexts if we're going to understand the dynamics that are also driving the US-China relationship. And there are at least 3 fundamental ways in which the world has changed now. Firstly, to put it very bluntly, the 21st century, where most of the US-China competition will take place, will be the Asian century. Now, what do I mean when I say it's going to be the Asian century? It means that the shift of economic power is going to move to Asia. The largest economies will be in Asia. And just to illustrate that point, in the 1960s, not so long ago, out of the top 5 economies, 0 were Asian. 0. Today, 3 out of the top 5 are Asian. And that future growth, as you know, is going to come from Asia. So that's one big shift that is happening. Secondly, on the geopolitical front, clearly we are moving from a unipolar world to at least a bipolar world. And I like to say that it's actually a bipolar world in a multipolar sea, because lots of new powers are emerging, becoming more assertive. And so the unipolar moment that the United States enjoyed at the end of the Cold War is gone. But many people haven't adjusted to the fact that it is gone, and that you now have to live in a world where you have to contend with peer powers and other significant powers who are not necessarily going to bend to the wishes of the great powers so easily. So it's a much more complex world that we have to deal with. And thirdly, an equally important point, in the cultural dimension too, we are seeing some fundamental shifts that are happening, where we've had a world, in a sense, that has been dominated by one civilization, Western civilization, for the past 200 years, and Western states, as you know, colonized the whole. 100 years ago, if you were sitting here in 1924, the West ran the whole world effortlessly, right? Now you have a multi-civilizational world, where civilizations that have been dominant are re-emerging and coming back in strength. So even on the cultural front, it's a different world. So within this larger global context, we are also seeing the US-China contest. So why is it happening? The reason, quite simply, is that the United States is doing what exactly any number one power would do when it sees the emergence of a competitor. It makes sure that the competitor doesn't overtake it, so it is pushing it down. That's what all great powers have done. So what the US is doing is not surprising. It's predictable. And if you put X or Y, that's exactly what will happen, because the US has been used to being number one. It doesn't want to see this place to another power. But at the same time, while this is predictable and expected, what is not clear to the rest of the world that is obviously watching this contest and is very worried about this contest, what exactly are the main strategic goals of the United States in this contest? And this, frankly, as I say in my book, Has China Won? That insight I got from Henry Kissinger in a one-on-one conversation when I was writing my book, Has China Won? And Hamid, to some extent, you alluded to it in your remarks too. So, for example, is it the goal of the United States to stop the economic growth of China. Maybe that's why you have trade tariffs, chips, sanctions, and so on and so forth. Is that the goal? Can't be done. Or is it the goal to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party? Again, I'll explain later, it can't be done. Or is it the goal to do what United States did with the Soviet Union, contain it effectively, leave it confined to a small universe, and have it disengaged from the rest of the world? Again, as I'll explain later, it can't be done. So then at the end of the day, what the world is asking is, what exactly does the United States want to accomplish in this contest, and what will be the end game? I think all would agree that by far the most dangerous issue in the US-China bilateral relationship is Taiwan. If there's one thing that could cause a war between the United States and China, it is Taiwan. And I think you all know that from the Chinese point of view, Taiwan is the last living symbol of the century of humiliation, because Taiwan, as you know, was first separated from China after China lost the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So not bringing Taiwan back is seen like a sort of a continuing wound in Chinese civilization that has to be fixed. But at the same time, to prevent war, the best thing we can do is to keep the status quo as it is and not change it in any way. And so those who want to preserve peace in Taiwan Straits, keep the status quo. And some of it is fictional, of course. The fiction is that the Republic of China represents all of China. But that's a fiction that's actually very important for peace. The minute you drop that, you create war. Now, at the same time, I think we must all understand and respect the desire of the people of Taiwan to keep their lifestyles as it is. They don't want to change. They don't want to join mainland China. That's understandable. But if you want to find a solution that accommodates both the desire of the Taiwanese people to keep the way of life they're used to without any change whatsoever, without any fear, without any difference, and to also prevent a war, it can be done. But the question is, do you want to see peace across Taiwan Straits, or do you want to see a war? So I must say, to be fair, many US administrations have understood that very, very well. So when President Chen Shui-bian of Taiwan emerged, as you know, in around 2003-2004, it was President George W. Bush that made it very clear to President Chen Shui-bian, I will not allow you to have a referendum. That was a very wise decision made by the President of the United States. So the US government understands the sensitivity of this issue. So that's got to be very carefully managed. I don't buy the conventional wisdom in the Anglo-Saxon media, which is, by the way, always wrong on China. In 1990, when the economists first predicted the coming collapse of the Chinese economy, in 1990, the Chinese GNP was $360 billion. A few months ago, the economists again came out with a story saying the Chinese economic growth is over. By then, it had grown to 18 trillion. It had grown 50 times after 30 years of predictions of the coming collapse of China. Why do I emphasize that? China's rise is unstoppable. And it's not driven by you or by me. It's driven by 1.4 billion Chinese people. And I'm sure you read the column by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times last week, in which he said, if 1.4 billion Chinese people decide to become prosperous, nothing can stop them. And the Chinese people have this great desire to do as well as the rest of the world. And so they have China. By the way, China's economy has serious problems. Property bubble, demographic challenges, lack of investor confidence. These are all real issues. But at the end of the day, what we have learned is that there's one set of policy makers that seem to know how to fix their problems gradually. It is China. If you want me to answer your question directly about President Xi Jinping, I want you to know that, again, I want to go back to my point of 193 countries in the world. Almost no other country in the world passes judgment on the quality of the leader that they are dealing with. They accept the fact he is the leader and we have to deal with him. Good, bad, friendly, unfriendly. And frankly, I want to tell you this, if you don't mind, very directly. If you did a poll of 193 leaders and asked them in 2017, 2018, would you rather deal with President Xi Jinping or would you rather deal with President Donald Trump? I tell you, 193 countries would vote in favor of Xi Jinping. I'm serious. So when you emphasize that, it's a leader that's a problem, it's not the problem. You have to deal with a country. And I can tell you this, since I've spoken to many people, especially in third world countries, who have dealt with President Xi, they don't share your vision of President Xi. They see him as a sane, sober, rational, predictable leader who is advancing China's interests quite effectively. I mean, at the end of the day, you look at where China was when he took power, 2014, where China is 2024, it has come a long way. So whatever we do, we don't underestimate him or China. By the way, we also don't underestimate United States. I want to assure you that the respect for United States is deep and profound and very strong. But in the same way, there's also the same deep, profound respect for China. And we know we have to deal with these two great powers. And actually, we believe that the United States would be better off. Now, don't call it engagement, don't call it containment, just deal with the reality. The reality, there is a strong, great power like China, and you have to live with it. And then figure out what's the best way of living with it in a way that enhances America's national interests. And I would say for America to defend its national interests is perfectly legitimate. But in many ways, the world would be happier if, given all the extraordinary challenges we are facing, for example, in climate change, you're the expert on climate change. The most sensible thing humanity could do is to tell the United States and China, please, we have a bigger problem coming. If we burn up planet Earth, we have nothing left to live on. We're destroying the only ship we have. Why don't we press the pause button on this geopolitical contest? Frankly, it's less important than the global challenges we face. So if you ask me what the rest of the world thinks, they actually hope that the United States and China could find ways and means of dealing with their differences in such a way that it doesn't destabilize the rest of the world and allows us to focus on what's really important that's coming in the future.